Listen to a lecture in a geology class.
Recently, 2 oarfish washed up on the shores of Southern California. These large, deep-water fish are rarely seen by humans because they live so far below the surface. Some researchers think that the discovery of these washed-up oarfish might actually be a warning sign of an upcoming natural disaster. The reason for these predictions is that a similar group of oarfish washed ashore in Japan shortly before the 9.0 magnitude earthquake in Japan in 2011. Some researchers believe that deep-sea fish are particularly sensitive to underwater seismic movements, and therefore, their appearance near the surface suggests seismic activity down below. Okay, there's much debate among the scientific community about how or even if animals might be able to predict earthquakes. However, a newly published study postulates that rocks along active fault lines are stressed by seismic activity, and as a result, these rocks emit various particles into the water that animals may be able to sense. In other words, these stressed rocks release a warning of impending seismic activity that can be perceived by certain animals. But the notion that animals can predict earthquakes is not new at all. Let me just give you some background before we talk about the recent research. In 373 BC, ancient historians recorded that animals, such as snakes and rats, mysteriously fled the ancient Greek city of Hellissi prior to a massive earthquake. For several days before the earthquake struck Hellissi, the inhabitants of the town noticed that rats and snakes and various kinds of insects were abandoning the town along the road that led in and out of it. While the inhabitants of Hellissi were filled with amazement by this unusual spectacle, they were unable to understand the reason for the mass exodus of rats and snakes and insects. So, several days after these creatures had departed, an earthquake hit the town during the night, destroying most of the town, and what remained of the town was washed into the ocean by an immense tidal wave caused by the earthquake. But this didn't only happen in the ancient world. In 1975, in a Chinese city named Haicheng, many people reported that snakes were emerging from their burrows about a month before the city was struck by a sizable earthquake. Okay, this was particularly odd because it occurred in the middle of winter. The snakes were in the middle of their annual hibernation, and with temperatures far below freezing, leaving their burrows in such temperatures was essentially suicide for the cold-blooded reptiles. Chinese officials at first weren't sure what to make of this strange phenomenon, but unlike the situation in Hellissi, the authorities eventually ordered the evacuation of the city. Subsequently, a 7.3 magnitude earthquake struck the region. Over 25,000 people were injured, but the Chinese government estimated that the number of injuries would have exceeded 150,000 if the evacuation was not made. But of course, there was no scientific documentation of either event. Probably the first scientific study to document animal behavior before an earthquake came from a group of researchers studying the mating behavior of frogs in a pond in central Italy in 2009. So, of course, these researchers had no idea that an earthquake was going to hit Italy. But they noticed that breeding pairs of frogs were leaving the pond at an alarming rate. Several days later, there was a 6.3 magnitude earthquake in Italy. Despite the fact that the pond where these frogs were was about 90 miles from the earthquake epicenter, The researchers believed that the frogs were reacting to some phenomena connected to the earthquake. The researchers recorded that 5 days before the earthquake struck, the number of frogs in the pond dropped by an astonishing 96%. 3 days before the earthquake, the number of frogs suddenly dropped to 0. And later, after the aftershocks of the primary earthquake subsided, the frogs returned to the same pond. It was not exactly clear to the researchers what the frogs were responding to prior to the earthquake, but they noticed that the frogs' migration coincided with disruptions in the ionosphere, the lowest level of Earth's atmosphere, which researchers detected around the time of the earthquake. Now, there's no consensus among the scientific community about how animals might be able to predict an earthquake. However, it is well documented that prior to major earthquakes, that many subtle changes in the environment take place. These changes are detectable on the surface of the land, in bodies of water, and in the atmosphere. And now there seems to be some evidence that could make a connection between changes in the environment and peculiar animal behavior preceding an earthquake. So, in a recently published study, some researchers suggest that when rocks are stressed by seismic activity, such as movement along fault lines, electric charges are released, and when they reach the lower atmosphere, animals are able to detect them. So, this is how it works when tectonic stresses build up in the Earth's crust. Electric charges are activated, which can travel remarkably quickly through rock. These electric charges have oxygen molecules that have a defective electron. The electric charges are remarkable in that they can flow out of the stressed rock and spread out wide and far into the surrounding unstressed rocks. Traveling fast and far when the electric charges arrive at the Earth's surface and come in contact with the atmosphere, the defective electrons cause air ionization, injecting massive amounts of primarily positive air ions into the lower atmosphere. When they arrive in areas where rock meets bodies of water, such as lakes or even the bottom of the ocean, instead of the atmosphere, these electric charges oxidize water into hydrogen peroxide. Yeah, the same stuff you use to clean a wound when you cut yourself. It seems that the hydrogen peroxide is toxic and irritates certain species of animals. So, in the case of the frogs in Italy, perhaps the frogs were experiencing some degree of irritation caused by the hydrogen peroxide and decided to flee the pond.